Welcome to Shaping the NYC Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with my co-host,
Brenda Slukowski.
Hello, Skyliners, and welcome to the Skyline Express.
The Skyline Express.
I like that.
Yeah,
Look at us.
that's right. I'm lean and mean, just like our law firm, Side and Shine PC.
Efficiency at its finest.
I really like to use the
Contact
PC, just like I used to like I call myself Esquire.
Oh, yeah. ESQ is at the end of my personal email.
Isn't that what Bill and Ted, when they went on their excellent adventure?
That was my first introduction to Keanu Reeves, and I loved him.
I always thought he was very, very underappreciated. And then just think about all the amazing movies he's done. Keanu Reeves,
He has
John
a lot
Wick.
of it.
Speed.
Right? Speed was so great.
Such a good movie.
I mean, a concept of like, this bus has to go a certain mile. You can't say like, who thought of that concept? It's such a great concept. I
I know.
love it. I want to see other things like that, like things that you can't control and you just have to deal with how fast it goes, like the Skyline Express. Get on or we will leave you behind. Because New York City is moving forward. We're evolving.
We're a
getting
fast-paced
better.
community.
It's constantly moving.
Constantly moving, constantly growing and getting better. And that's actually something that we discussed with our guest, Eli Weiss of Joy Construction.
Yeah.
And it gives me a joy to say Joy Construction. And it makes me mad that he's always partnering with Mad Equities. No, I'm just kidding. He is a frequent collaborator with Mad Equities, and I just enjoy
You
that
had to do
wordplay.
it.
I think it's very indicative of him as a person. I know he joined with partners who already had formed Joy Construction, but it's indicative of his approach to real estate and the community that he's trying to help. He's coming from such a joyful place that he wants to enhance his community and provide more housing. And he understands the logistics of the fact that if you're not providing more housing, rent's going to go up for the existing housing. You know, he's very involved in providing this affordable housing, and I appreciate his approach to it.
Yeah, and I thought it was very interesting that he has dealt with both sides. He worked with HDC before, and now he's a private developer.
Yeah. He worked for New York City Housing Development Corporation, doing financing and syndicating tax credits and helping with public funding of affordable housing projects. And then now he's on the reverse side of the table, but you'll hear something that I talk about, which is it's not like being a defense attorney and then becoming a prosecutor or vice versa, because really everybody's the city, the private developers, they're all working towards one goal, which is to create housing. I mean, in this context, it's affordable housing, but we are big proponents of housing in general. On this podcast, we work with mixed income developers, not always, not exclusively, but a lot of the time, where there's an affordable housing and a market rate component. And that market rate component is important. One, it provides subsidy for the affordable units that are there. And two, you need different people from different economic backgrounds and statuses all living together. You don't want to just segregate. That's not the answer. We were really impressed with Eli, and we're so excited to talk to him.
Something I really enjoyed hearing about is his perspective from the syndication side about your light tech deals and your tax exempt bonds. I enjoyed hearing the intricacies of that because that's not something we deal with every day. So it's always a learning opportunity for us on this podcast as well.
And it's relationships. It's another theme that we've had and we've seen weaving in and out, relationships and where you came from. He came from South Brooklyn. So I almost feel like he's a little bit of a cousin because everybody in that area, just, you know what you grew up like, and it was a different atmosphere and we know the same places. And so it felt very home-like for him to be here, but to see, you know, where he's gone and how he got there based on his start in real estate, which was really with his grandparents and seeing how they dealt with the buildings they own in that neighborhood, which is, you know, these little, a few units, a few apartments, whatever it was, similar to what my mom was doing and how I learned about real estate. And now he's taking it up a notch and up a level.
Yeah.
And he is a really knowledgeable person. He tells it like it is. Yes, he's optimistic about the general development scene and atmosphere, but things are looking a little down because of just the political environment and how people are reacting.
And yet he was still so optimistic.
You have to be optimistic.
Yeah.
That's what he said. As a developer, you have to be optimistic. And I think that's right, because nobody would undertake these massive projects with all the liability they entail and this degree of criticism that comes with it, because you're putting out something that is going to be for public use, that people are going to be able to see from the street, that's going to be taxed, it's going to be part of
the New York City skyline.
Oh, I love that we did that together. And that's true. And so we've been loving to do this podcast because we've learned, just imagine all the great stuff that we've picked up, the relationships that we've formed with our guests. And we've had such amazing guests, has been just hitting it out of the park constantly. And the same holds true for Eli. And you'll hear him talk about all this stuff, his beginnings. And we were super impressed and can't wait for our Skyliners.
So here he comes, guys, Mr. Eli Weiss.
Joy Construction.
Hey guys, how are you?
Hey, everybody.
Happy day.
It is. It's a beautiful day. It's still a little cold outside, I think.
Yeah, but our offices are very hot, so I like to open the window.
I don't understand why it is that people put the heat to an exponential degree in office building.
You've
I'll
never
never
seen a man
understand
overcompensate for things?
You know
Well,
what?
this is off to an interesting start.
If you haven't noticed, it's another voice in the room who shall remain anonymous until we announce him. But yeah, it's actually less hot. Oh, because you opened
Because
the
I
window.
opened the
the window.
window.
You opened the window. Okay, that makes sense. Well, now we know why office buildings aren't occupied and everybody stays at home to work because they can control their own AC and their own HVAC.
Amen.
We have a very special guest today, and I'm super excited. He's a really nice guy, and he's someone who I didn't grow up with him, but he's a native Brooklynite, and he's from South Brooklyn, where I'm from, Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, Coney Island area. He's a graduate of Yeshiva Flatbush, where I went also in the
Fellow alum.
a fellow alum in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. Then he went on to go to Yeshiva University, which is not too surprising for a Yeshiva Flatbush student. A lot of my friends went to YU also.
Did you live in the Heights?
I did live in the Heights. Yeah, at 187th in Amsterdam,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
A bunch of my
Which-
friends lived right there when they went to YU.
which came full circle because we ended up building a very large project at Inwood, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that. That's a very interesting project, mostly because of a lot of the running around, the waiting, and the anxiety that surrounded the issues, and we'll get into that. So you went to YU, you got a BS in finance. You went to NYU, got an MS in real estate. And then if that wasn't enough, right, you need to go to law school. So you went to Seton Hall.
So
Get a JD.
I did my law degree and my master's degree concurrently.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah.
So real overachiever. You worked on Wall Street for a while and then went to HTC where the love of real estate really shine. And now you're the head honcho at Joy Construction.
I don't know if I'm the head honcho. I'm a principal. I run the development side of the business. And I have two partners who run the construction side of the business who actually founded Joy Construction in 1995. And it was a third party construction business. And I actually met the folks at Joy while I was a project manager at HTC, and they were the GC, the general contractor, on some of the projects that I was financing. You know, I once saw a great interview with Jamie Foxx, and he said that when he was younger, his grandmother made him take classical piano lessons, and he hated it. And then when he was older and he wanted to get the role to play Ray Charles in Ray, he had this huge advantage of knowing how to play piano. And he said that, you know, life is all about filling up your toolbox. And many times you fill up your toolbox with things and skills that you think you may not use or anything that you can put in your toolbox. And to circle back, my two partners are Israeli. And I'm sure you remember at Flatbush,
Yep.
we learned Hebrew very intensively.
Biblical Hebrew.
Right, very intensively. And I met my partners at a closing speaking Hebrew, and I noticed they spoke Hebrew, and I went over and I started to speak Hebrew with my unbelievable.
Oh, you bageled them.
I bageled them. I did. I think I pita bread them.
Oh,
Right. Yeah.
fair
But it was more of a pita bread when I was in Flatbush and I had to study Hebrew. And it was, like I said, very intensive program. It was, as they call it, Hebrew in Hebrew, which meant that in your Hebrew class, there was no English. And
That's how they immersed you in
Yeah.
the language.
and I thought, when am I ever going to use this? And what's funny is, you know, that skill that I picked up, my parents did not speak Hebrew, do not speak Hebrew. That skill that I picked up was the reason I ended up meeting my partners and forming this partnership. And basically what we started to do once I came aboard in 2008 was to partner with other developers, and we would act as the GC. And, you know, over the years, we've sort of kept that model where we're involved in many joint venture partnerships. And the reason for that is I run a very small development team. I have 3 people on my development team and 1 person who handles MWBE hiring. That's sort of under my purview as well. But I've always wanted to keep a lean staff because development is very cyclical. And, you know, I always wanted to keep it lean and everybody very, very focused. So one of the things that I think separates Joy Construction from a lot of other development companies is we do everything in-house, from the construction to the value engineering to the pre-construction services. You know, I review contracts. Everything we do in-house. So I never really wanted to get a big staff and sort of lose control of the process. And, you know, we develop, I would say, primarily affordable housing, but we've also developed luxury rentals in New York.
Hotels as well.
Hotels as well. That's right. You know, I think right now our book of business is probably 85% affordable housing. And that's really just a function of, you know, legislative issues in New York regarding rental tax abatements and also the financing market right now. And, you know, that's really what's pushed us back to about 85%. But even, you know, in previous times, we were probably 65% affordable housing.
Yeah.
And we generally work on 6 to 8 projects at a time. And the company has about 160 employees. Most of them are on the construction management side. And it's been a great 17-year run. You know,
No, I mean, there's so much that Joy has done over the last probably 30 years, and for you about 20, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to pull back just a little bit, only because there's a ton that we missed, which is your passion for real estate, let's call it, started with your grandparents, and a lot of the things that I did in my life also stemmed from my parents, my mother specifically, and my grandparents. And they owned real estate after having owned businesses. They bought the buildings that they ran their businesses from.
So my grandfather, Jack Weiss, may he rest in peace, and he passed away in 2019 at the age of 96.
Amazing.
He owned a takeout food store in Brighton Beach called Israel's Takeout Food on 409 Brighton Beach Avenue. And starting in the late 1960s, started buying the taxpayer buildings on Brighton Beach Avenue. And I think at the peak, he owned about 10 of them. And I got my passion from real estate mostly from him, because I would say that when I went to visit him in the store, I knew I didn't want to do that. And then I saw...
You saw him collecting rent?
I saw him collecting rent.
You have to know what you don't want in order to figure out what you do want.
I mean, I had the same experience. My mom was, sends you to collect rent. And I don't know how it is back then. They're not doing it with checks. They're doing all cash, right?
All cash.
So I'm sitting there in a car counting like $4,000 in cash, making sure that it's like, it seems shady. It's not. It's this older woman who was renting out this place. But I think you had probably that same experience, right?
100%. And I think growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. They all lived in the neighborhood, and we were very close. And I saw that, it wasn't development, but every time my grandfather would tenant a store, there was a service that was provided. And I always say, I'm always fascinated with the real part of real estate more than the estate part. The estate part is the nuts and bolts, the financing and all that. But there is a component of the real estate that's real. I mean, if you rent to a supermarket, that's where people get their food. If you rent to a barber shop, that's where people get their haircut. And I sort of enjoyed watching this ecosystem get created.
You know what he enjoyed?
Shaping the
New York City skyline. Guys, I did it.
Well, I mean, these were 2-story taxpayer buildings, so under an elevated train on Brighton Beach Avenue. So I don't know that we were shaping the skyline, but we definitely...
The skyline is also metaphorical.
That is true. Okay. That is true. I mean, really, growing up in...
That's deep, by the way, Brenda.
Growing up in South Brooklyn, nothing really changed. And then in Brighton Beach until this mega development called Oceana was built. And that to me also had a major impact on me, because it was my train station, the Brighton Beach train station. Yep. So I watched the community being built, and it changed Brighton Beach dramatically from people living in walk-up buildings and older pre-war buildings to luxury condos on the beach. And to be very candid with you, I think that's what spurred me to sort of think a little bit about development, because like I said, my grandfather would buy a building and, put in a tenant and collect rent. It was not, a very sophisticated operation. Everything was on napkins and,
Yeah, but at the base, that's what the business is. At the crux of it, right? At the heart of it.
For sure. But I think for me, when Oceana was developed, first of all, it was a tremendous adaptive reuse of what was once the Brighton Beach Baths, which was like a beach club.
They had Discover Day Camp out of.
Exactly right. That's right.
Summers.
And so for me, I think that's what piqued my interest in seeing something literally go through a transformative adaptive reuse of space. And, by the time the late 1990s occurred, nobody was going to the Brighton Beach Baths anymore. It was sort of on its way to becoming defunct. And the Muss organization acquired the site, and they built condos there, and everybody thought it would be a complete failure.
Myself included, by the way. Because you're looking at a neighborhood that's, like you said, these pre-World War II buildings, some walk-ups, old elevators. One of the buildings that I grew up in was like that. And who's going to buy these $1 million condos?
And they all sold.
If anything, the prices doubled and even tripled.
Absolutely. And, it spoke to a few things. Number one, I think it sort of showed me one of the early lessons in that in New York, transportation and real estate are like peanut butter and jelly. I learned from that whatever it was that I thought, possibly David thought was a detraction, I also realized getting off the subway and walking 50 feet to your home was the dream. And that had a lot of value. And like I said, I think it changed the demographics of the whole neighborhood. And it's still a very viable project today. I have a lot of friends who live there. And I think that was what spurred me to sort of think to myself, that's something that I would want to do. I would want to build something or change something, mostly because I past that development every single day on my way to school and everything. So I had worked on Wall Street right after college, mostly because if you grow up a Jewish kid and you have a finance major, you have to go work on Wall Street. But
what kind of work did you do specifically?
I did equity analysis, equity research,
Mhm.
and I just didn't really fit in the culture. I mean, I'm
It also wasn't real.
Yeah, it wasn't real. I'm first generation American. Everybody had like the double breasted suit when I had the single breasted suit. I just, I didn't fit in there, and I sort of knew it, and I was honest with myself. And I was very fortunate that my grandparents were very, very pro higher education, having none themselves. And they helped me go back to school and get my law degree and my master's degree. And then I took a job with the city, first at the Division of Real Estate Services, doing land acquisitions for projects like the Staten Island Blue Belt, Water Tunnel number 3 staging sites. And then I got transferred to HDC, and that was probably the most important event in my career, because at a very young age, I was given 7-8 projects to manage, interacting with developers who were people I read about in the newspaper, and they needed to call me, and it was great. And I had a great team when I was at HTC, who I'm all still very close with. And that really was, for me, the impetus to eventually say, okay, now I understand the financing side of this. I understand all of the regulations. I still had
Let's
that.
do it privately.
Let's do it privately.
Yeah.
And so by meeting my partners at Joy through my toolbox of Hebrew, I was able to then sort of leverage the one aspect of development that I had no idea in what I was doing, which is construction. And so that was really a synergy that was really great, because my two partners, all they did was construction, and all I did was financing, dealing with government regulations, project management. And so it's been a great synergistic relationship for 17 years. And
what kind of stuff did you do at the HCC? I know you did financings, which then led you to do those types of financing, but on the development side. But can you give us a little glimpse into the types of transactions you handled?
Yeah, so
HCC?
I was issuing tax-exempt bonds for affordable housing projects. Back in the day, there was a lot more market rate interaction on the projects. Today, most of the projects are geared towards majority of lower income tiers. But back then, they had a program called 50-30-20, where 50% of the units were market, 30% were middle income, and 20% were low income.
And that's to subsidize so that the provide some subsidy.
Correct. The market rents were subsidizing. There was the old, Sign and Shine was the main law firm for the old 421A certificate deals. So I financed.
We're still selling a couple of them.
Right, I can imagine.
One or two, maybe.
Hit us up.
Right.
Not enough to hit us up, I don't think.
I built a bunch of those buildings and financed a bunch of those buildings. And I think I actually did the last 421A written agreement on a project in the Bronx in 2014 or 15, Washington Avenue. It was 65 units. And so we ended up with about 325 certificates. And basically, like I said, it was sort of a seamless transition for me, because even though I went from the public sector to the private sector, I was still doing the same thing, which was putting financing together, dealing with tax credits, dealing with regulations, abatements. And so it was a really seamless transition until October of 2008, when, besides from my daughter being born, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And obviously the financial crisis was at its peak. And at the time, we had this large scale project. It was a 3.5 acre site in the Bronx, in the Melrose section of the Bronx, called St. Anne's Terrace, which I needed to put together financing for. And it was extremely, extremely challenging. And I always say that my blessing in my career was that I was 30 years old when the financial crisis hit, because I was old enough and had an education to sort of know what to do and make intelligent choices. But I owned nothing. So it didn't matter that everything went to zero. When you have nothing, you have nothing to lose. So I was not as shaken up as people were during the financial crisis, because, like I said, I really didn't have any assets. That the projects that I was working on were underwater, but, they were not mine. I was, I had inherited this.
And that's exactly the year that you started, right? 2008 is when you started in Joy.
Yes, that is correct. And we ended up closing on that project in 2009. I had to put together 4 banks to do it. And we syndicated about $50 million of low-income housing tax credits, which 6 months earlier were selling for anywhere from $1.15 to $1.20 for a dollar credit. And we sold all of those credits for 85 cents. So it was a huge, huge accomplishment. I think it was the 14th largest construction loan closing in the country that year. And that's not to brag about my project. That's just to show how severe the crisis was. And, once we had that project going and we had cash flow coming in and earning fees, we continued to acquire sites to do more affordable. But what changed was we acquired a bunch of sites in Hudson Yards and basically built rental buildings, and we sold them basically at completion and lease up. And that was a big part of our business from about 2012 to 2019. And that came to a halt, unfortunately, when the rent laws changed and it sort of cast a shadow over multifamily as an investment in New York.
In other words, the business model was create the project and then sell it. But now you guys are more holding on to.
Yeah, there are the traditional buyers who are in that game are not in the New York market anymore. Look, a lot's changed in the New York market. I think there's a lot of fear, specifically politically on the legislative side, of laws changing, laws expiring, deadlock in Albany, the city council, overriding a mayoral veto. I think that was really difficult. But, what I always tell people is development is really just the process of taking something from X, doing whatever it is to get it to the highest value, X plus 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So, as things changed, we did different types of transactions. We built a administrative office building for Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is one of the projects I'm most proud of.
They leased up that entire building, right?
They leased up the entire building, and then they signed a long-term lease with us, and then
like years.
Yes, and then they acquired the site last year. And so, basically, I look at real estate development as this is what exists now. Am I able to do something that will change it, enhance it to get it to a better place or a more valuable place? And so we pivoted a lot. We did 2 hotels, a 4 Points by Sheraton in Hudson Yards that we still own and operate, the Civilian Hotel, which has a very swanky rooftop bar, if anybody's interested. Absolutely.
Espresso martinis.
Yeah.
I'm so down.
So, we pivoted, and that's what I think you have to do as a developer. I mean, one of the things that I'm struggling with right now is where do you pivot in today's market?
Nowhere to pivot.
Right. And I will tell you that, I've been very blessed in my career that not only I love what I do and I have amazing partners, many of other developers in New York have become very close friends of mine. Almost every real estate developer or investor I speak with right now is sort of like me. Like, I don't see where the opportunities are. I think, the easy thing to say is converting empty office space into residential, but I tell people that's really, wonderful for cocktail conversation. But, the cost of doing that is extremely high. These buildings have a tremendous amount of leverage on them. But, I don't see, lenders and investors just walking away and, letting all their equity go so somebody can build a rental building. And, the layouts and the design are not ideal for residential. And so, office is pretty much in a very difficult transition period, which I think goes beyond economics. I think it's structural. It's, you guys don't like to work in a hot office. You have to open the window. People don't want to go to work anymore, which is wild to me because internationally, the work from home sort of paradigm is much less than it is in New York. But most European countries are back to the office more than the United States. The United States is severely lagging. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm looking at it from the lens of real estate, which is, in central business districts, you're just going to have a lot less people, a lot less restaurants, a lot less everything. And unfortunately, what it really comes down to is a lot less tax revenue.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is what scares me. As we are in the 3rd inning, 4th inning of what's going on in the office market, in my opinion, because you still have a tremendous amount of leases that are going to roll over in the next few years, and tenants are not going to renew. And I think New York City is going to face a severe financial crisis over tax revenue. And it's definitely concerning. And like I said, everyone I speak to is, nobody has a great idea right now. Like I said, there were very clear models to effectuate development prior to COVID. And I would say since then, between COVID just shaking things up and interest rates doubling, I think a lot of us are really struggling to find, real opportunities right now. And that's why, like I said, 85% of what I do is affordable housing, because in affordable housing, your financing is locked up from the day you close. And, most business comes down to supply and demand. And if we build a 200-unit apartment, we're going to get 75,000 to 100 applicants. So the supply and demand paradigm is removed from the equation of risk. And, I'm very risk adverse right now.
Yeah.
I'm very risk adverse. And I think that's, again, with all my unnamed celebrity friends in real estate, that's the vibe that I get from everybody, which is they're very concerned about the legislative atmosphere in New York and basically, what's going to happen to New York if crime and quality of life issues don't improve, if tax revenue goes down. I think we're at a very, difficult juncture right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a difficult time. I think it's one of the reasons we started the podcast when we did, because there's a lot to talk about. But New York, like you said, it's cyclical. I don't think we have an answer yet. I remember from David Marks from Silverstein, he was on this podcast and he said something that Larry Silverstein had said, which is, I've read the obituary about New York time and time again.
Look, I'm not betting against New York. And I think anybody who has in the past has lost that bet.
Your New York Yankees hat.
I am wearing a Yankees hat right now. I've only lived in New York. I've never lived anywhere else.
Same.
I've, as a person who is supposed to be this, Bonneview guy who's a real estate developer, I've lived in a 4-mile radius my whole life. I've moved from Manhattan Beach to Lower Manhattan. That's as far as I've ever got.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those are very far from each other.
That's as far. I mean, I've been fortunate. I've traveled for vacation, but I've never really lived anywhere but New York. I miss it when I'm not here, but I think that all urban areas right now in the United States are facing very similar challenges. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. I think that, there's going to be a reckoning of, better politics, better management for these cities. And I just hope that it happens sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think the politics just has to catch up to what's happening, and things are happening so quickly, and information is not always readily available, and the trends aren't available. So I think it's tough to keep up with that.
Well, I mean, just to speak about it is, New York City for many years, and New York State actually had a law called 421A, which was a tax abatement for rental housing. And so, the law expired, and, there was no thought of what the implications would be. And now we've had the lowest amount of housing starts in many, many years. And what people don't understand about rental housing in New York is, to go back to my comment about supply and demand, if you're not building housing, you have two issues. One, it means the city can't grow, right? And then you're being decline, which is not ever what you want for any municipality or sovereign
Company.
Or company, right? You don't want to be in decline. And then if there's less inventory of apartments, it's not that complicated what will happen to rents. They up. That's right. And people sort of wanted more affordability in 421A, but I always explain to people, the market rate units, they subsidize the lower income units, but more importantly, there's a population that needs those units too. And so if you don't create supply, you are going to see rents go up. And I think that the faction in Albany that fought against 421A, in my opinion, mistakenly believed, well, the development community will just figure it out. They'll figure out ways to do it. But we can't. The reality is we're in a bit of a crosshairs right now because we have all of the problems I've discussed. And then you also have your cost of borrowing, which is, historically increased like it's never have in, I think, this country's history. It's the fastest increase of federal funds rate. So, basically, I'm not going to say that all of the reason that the housing starts were lower was 421A. I would say 99%, but it's also a very challenging time in financing in real estate. So, I think that we're all trying to sit back and figure out what's going to be next. And, I think that the state has done a great job in trying to come up with some workarounds for 421A with the Gowanus program. I think The city is trying to come up with some workarounds. But at the end of the day, I think there needs to be a recognition that building housing is really important in New York. And I have dedicated my career, both in the public and private sector, to the affordable housing industry. But we can't just build low income and middle income units. New York needs to be economically diverse. And in the same way that it's important to provide housing for people who are either lower or middle income or workforce housing, if you're going to want to have an economically diverse city, I know it's not very popular when people build for very wealthy people, but if we're going to want those people to live in New York and we want that diversity, there needs to be that product too.
And the tax revenue.
And the tax revenue.
And
that's right.
This is something that we've stated a number of times. I don't think recently, but yes, I think housing is the answer, not just middle, moderate, low, luxury housing.
Absolutely. Production.
Yeah.
I will tell you guys a story. When we built 431 West 37th Street, a building that was called the Montana, we proformed rents at $50 a foot in 2010. By 2012, when we leased the building up, it was $68 a foot. And the increase was because in 08 and 09, the financial crisis inhibited financing for multifamily. And that's when I saw it so clearly. I said, rents went up in an 18-month period, mostly because there was just no new supply coming online. And, like I said, when it comes to housing, I always say the first rule is production in New York. Obviously, in other markets, that may not be the case. But in New York, we just need to produce a lot of housing.
See it happening right now.
Yeah. And I think I think we're still at a historic deficit of the amount of housing units we need in New York. And so any pause just sets us back further and further.
I read an interesting article. One of the things you said which is similar to what you've been talking about right now, which is you said that New York should focus on creating programs that allow market rate units to finance affordable units and should approach rezonings through the lens which neighborhoods would benefit most. I'll get to that point, but I wanted to make another point, which is you had said affordable housing to me is the most challenging part of real estate. You're taking something that mathematically shouldn't make sense, and you're financially engineering and using various government programs to ultimately put together deals that are far more complicated in terms of capitalization than your standard market rate transactions. So one of the tools in your toolbox, and one of the things that you took from HTC, not just the contact, the people, but the fundamental knowledge of how it works, which is, to me, it's complicated because I've not syndicated a deal, is put together these complex publicly financed deals, which you can say, well, I brought these people in, I found a property. It sounds all easy. And I don't want you to explain all the technical details, but how, in a nutshell, if it can be a nutshell, how do you put something like that together? And you've done that time and time again, both on the government side and the private side. So
essentially, it's a myriad of programs from different agencies, both at the federal and state and city level. So your typical HPD, HDC low income deal will have an allocation of tax exempt bonds that allows, because they're tax exempt, that means the interest rate is cheaper because they're not paying taxes on the interest earned from those bonds. The issuance of those bonds also triggers the project to be eligible for a 4% low-income housing tax credit. So the equity in these affordable deals is really tax credits that get syndicated and sold to financial institutions to offset their tax obligations. And then in between that, there are various layers of subsidy that you apply for. But your typical low-income deal has 4 to 5 tranches of financing that are completely different with completely different lenders. The New York City Housing Development Corporation, HTC, they issue the bonds, but in order to sort of mimic the construction loan process, a construction lender, a Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs issues a letter of credit to credit enhance those bonds and also administers the construction because the bondholders do not want to take on construction risk. So what was brilliant about this is that you're basically creating a synthetic tax exempt product because let's just say JP Morgan was the credit enhancer. You're buying JP Morgan credit on a tax exempt basis. So it's a synthetic tax play. And, I tell people all the time, I've done market rate transactions, like I said, in hospitality, office, community facility, retail. I've done it all. There is no capital stack that is as complex as an affordable housing deal. It is just beyond complex. There are layers of rules and regulations that go into it. And at every level of the deal, there are, rules from various different agencies that you have to make all work together. I take my hat off to really, there are a few people, and I will name them. Yes, Chuck Brass, Rich Froelich, may he rest in peace, who's a close friend of mine. Rachel Grossman, who's now at JP Morgan. These people created these programs and really thought of ways to financially engineer, and leverage public resources in a way that created so much housing. And
why would these private banks go into this?
The real driving force behind private sector banks investing in this product is what's known as CRA credit, the Community Reinvestment Act. I think it was passed in the late 1970s. And basically before that, banks would, I think the word is redline neighborhoods and not invest in low-income neighborhoods. And the Community Reinvestment Act required banks to invest in low-income neighborhoods. So basically when a bank, and they charge fees, this is not, it's not a giveaway. It's not out of the goodness of their heart, but they do have CRA credit that they need to earn. And they go through reviews of every 3 or 5 years if they've earned the appropriate amount of CRA credit. And if they don't, there are penalties that the government imposes on them. So it's mostly CRA driven. These are not the most lucrative deals for the banks, but they're great PR. There's almost no risk of default. I think if you look back in the history of the low-income housing tax credit program, which was created in 1986 when President Reagan and Congress rewrote the tax code, the default rate on tax credit buildings is almost nil. And so banks view it as low risk. They have to do it because of CRA. And like I said, they do charge fees. And so it's always good to have a business that's low risk, that is fee-based.
Yeah.
I came into the private sector as a developer, having run these deals for 3 years as at HGC. And so I was one of the lenders. So when I went to the other side of the table, it was not very foreign for me. I think where I had a big, steeper learning curve was on the equity side, on the tax credit equity side, because essentially the investor who acquires the tax credits is your partner, a limited partner, but the developer is the general partner, mostly known as the GP, and the investor is the limited partner, the LP. And I think when I was at HDC, I didn't really have a lot of insight into that negotiation because it didn't impact the lender. And I was, a first position lender. It's the best place to be. So I didn't really get that far down into the capital stack to understand the nuances of the equity. So there was definitely a learning curve for me there. But, I will tell you that if you look at, I again, this is more to the listeners. I know you guys are consummate professionals in this field.
Mm-hmm.
The organizational charts of an affordable housing deal are, sort of war and peace level books compared to your standard organizational chart on a market rate transaction. They're much more complex. They're much more tax driven. And, it's a lot of parties that you're balancing.
The other thing I wanted to talk about is you gathered your tools, just to use your words.
Absolutely.
And those tools, you use them not against, but in favor of private development versus being on the government side. You're still accomplishing the same exact goal. It's just that you were doing it for a different party.
Absolutely. My job has been the same for 20 years. It's putting together financing and putting together deals to build affordable housing. I've done other types of deals from time to time, but I would say that my main area of expertise and the transaction that I've done most often is an affordable housing transaction. And to be very candid, my family came to this country as refugees in World War II. My grandparents lived in a displaced persons camp from 1945 to 1950 in Berlin. And I don't want to, I don't want to be all poetic and say I do this from the goodness of my heart and I'm an angel. Obviously, it's what I do to make a living and provide for my family. But it definitely was a field that was attractive to me because, like I said, my family came here as refugees and they started, with very modest housing accommodations. And I saw the difference of, the progression. And so I can't lie and say that that didn't have a huge impact on me.
Yeah, and it should. Those things that you saw as a kid, just like myself, it's you want that stability, and you're almost creating that stability, putting it out there in the world because it's the stability
For sure.
you wanted for your family and
For
your
sure.
grandparents.
You know, one of the things that we're tackling now in New York, and when I mean we, I mean all of us, is a homelessness crisis. And, you know, a lot of homelessness is connected to mental health. And one of the great areas in affordable housing that we've been able to get involved in, mostly through joint ventures with non-for-profits, is supportive housing. And supportive housing is not only affordable housing, so whereas the rents are geared so that people can afford them, but there are also social services on site to help people. And there was a great article by Malcolm Gladwell called $1 Million Murray, and it followed around this drug addicted veteran in some town in Arizona. And he was arrested in the hospital and drug rehab and this and arrested again and picked up. And at the end of the year, they realized that the municipality spent $1 million on this guy and he was right back to where he was. And so we're building right now several supportive housing projects where we partner with a nonprofit who's both our joint venture development partner, but will provide the social services once the building is finished and placed in service. And, you know, I personally feel like that is one of the major ways we can tackle the homelessness crisis in New York. And look, I live here. I've only lived here. I'm sort of stuck here because I never learned to drive a car. So
Really?
yeah,
That's
Wow,
actually
that
that
is
part. South Brooklyn is really known for
I
driving.
had a mongoose bicycle when I was a kid, but that was it. I never learned to drive a car, and so I'm really stuck here. So I guess I view affordable housing, supportive housing. I try to build the things that I build to make New York a better place.
Supportive housing is an amazing concept. What kind of social services are they providing specifically to those
Well,
tenants?
typically, you know, each nonprofit focuses on different sort of needs. So there are nonprofits that focus on veterans who have PTSD. There's people who may have substance abuse issues. There's people who just have your standard mental health issues. So it basically goes by what nonprofit is involved and what their specialty is in terms of, you know, handling a tenant population that has unique challenges.
But the supportive housing units are not limited to just those tenants facing those issues, right?
Correct. I mean, there is a presence on staff there's a presence of social workers constantly in the building.
Okay.
Traditionally, supportive housing was just supportive housing, and there were no other types of units in the project. Although now the city is moving to more of a mixed program where they're putting affordable housing and supportive housing together. And look, you know, one of the things that I always loved about New York is that it's very diverse. And one of the things that I think makes the city such a great place is that there's income diversity and people learn to live with people who are very different than them, not just from a demographic point of view, but from an income point of view. I mean, every day I take the subway 7 times, going back to my lack of driving skills, but you know, you can be on the subway next to a big Wall Street banker and next to somebody who's completely homeless and, you know, with a cup asking for donations. And obviously, you know, the latter is not the ideal. But I think what makes New York neat is this diversity, that there are buildings that are 80-20s where 20% of the population is low income and 80% is not. I think it creates a sense of community that at the end of the day, you know, we're all in this together. Most cities that I've been to out of New York are very, very separate in the sense that, you know, wealthy people live here, poor people live there. And then they don't really interact. And I think it sort of defeats the concept of community. I think one of the issues now is that the homeless shelter system is so overwhelmed.
And broken.
Right. And broken. Look, we have a few broken things in the city.
True.
We have the New York City Housing Authority, which, you know, tonight a population the size of the entire population of Boston will go to sleep in public housing in New York. So, you know, when people speak about NYCHA, it's a city. And, you know, the properties were in dire need of repair and are in dire need of repair. And they've done some great programs to do long-term leases to developers to fix them and manage them outside of NYCHA's procurement process and, you know, myriad of regulations that make it impossible to function. But, you know, it's a huge amount of people living in very, very, very subpar housing conditions. And, there's going to be a big check that needs to be written to get that fixed. I actually was involved in a project where I acquired air rights from NYCHA and paid NYCHA a fee for the air rights, and that would go towards capital improvements of the NYCHA complex that we acquired it from. But unfortunately, we paid NYCHA $24.8 million for the air rights, and the capital needs of that complex were in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
That was a drop.
So, I'm happy that I did it. It was the first transaction of its kind, and it required us to go to HUD for approval. But, at the end of it, I sort of realized it was a drop. It's sort of like throwing a rock into the Pacific Ocean.
But you got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. Look, all of this stuff, we could sit here. You're catching me at a time in the market, and where it's been a challenging in every level. Been a challenging time for all of us. And I could definitely be doom and gloom, but I'm a developer. I gotta be optimistic.
I think you're very optimistic, but I also think you're telling it like it is, like we want to tell everybody that's listening.
Does anyone live on the Upper East Side here?
Yeah.
Where do you live?
I'm on 90th and 3rd.
Oh, 90th and 3rd. So the new Trader Joe's under the bridge?
The only Trader Joe's I know of is on 59.
Yeah, under the bridge.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
So we did that.
I got really excited that there was going to be a new Trader Joe's.
No. Mad Equities and Joy Construction did that project. We acquired it.
Great TJ Maxx there too.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
So you've partnered with Mad a ton, right?
Yeah. Joy were the initials of the firstborn child of the partners. And Mad, the principal of Mad Equities, is George Madruga. And so he did MAD Equities, that was taken. Then he did MDD, and that was Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So he just kept adding a D. People think that there was some huge, marketing campaign that went behind this. Every time he couldn't get that LLC, he just added a D.
Well, How did that relationship get formed? Because, yes, I'm sure you've partnered with other developers, but it seems like a lot lately or recently.
For at least 20 years.
Yeah.
So I inherited the relationship from my partners at Joy, who were building for George Madruga at the time, building as a third-party general contractor. And then, by the time I came on board, they were already acquiring land together. But, I'm blessed. I have 3 business partners. We're all very good friends. We've watched our children grow up together. We go on vacations together. I just told somebody today that, that's been the biggest blessing of my career, which is so many people in my industry are friends, and
a lot of people really know each other. Especially
look,
the
you guys are lawyers, and Steve Coppell, Aviva, and I have been closing deals together for 20 years. Aviva and I get on calls, and we just texting each other like, "All right, let's do this. We'll do this. How about this?" We know how each other. We know. Aviva is probably one of the great legal minds in our field, but when you work with someone for 20 years, besides the friendship that we have, you start to learn how they think, and it just makes it much more smooth. And it is a complex industry. So these long-term relationships that you have with people are really important.
That's
absolutely.
So relationships is also another theme that's come out, is how important relationships are. You can't do anything in a vacuum, no matter. And we've talked to some brilliant people, yourself included. And I mean that in all sincerity. I wouldn't have invited you to come on the show if I didn't think so. But it's just amazing how those relationships are so important.
Most important thing.
Is that one thing that you were able to take away from HDC and from your time at Joy? How did you learn that? Is what I'm asking. How did you figure that out? Because it takes a lot of people a long time to figure that out.
So in 2008, when we were closing that St. Anne's Terrace project at 641 units, I saw how quickly banks were dropping out of the deal. And I realized if I was going to get to a closing table, there was no way to be sure the bank would show up. We were getting term sheets that said this is subject to, federal stress tests. And, this was not a local bank. This was JP Morgan. This was Capital One. This was, large institutions. And there were a few people on that transaction that I went out and spoke to either over lunch or over a drink. And I remember realizing, I don't care what the term sheet says. I don't care. Are you going to be there? Are you going to close with me? And I realized more, and I tell this to my son all the time. I said, most of business is just the space between people. The reality is, relationships are such a crucial part of any business or any organization. But in real estate, especially in affordable housing, because it's such a close-knit community and because you're dealing with a public-private partnership between government and the private sector, relationships are crucial. And like I said, most of my friends, I remember at my son's bar mitzvah, I looked around the room and it was like an affordable housing conference.
Maybe we really need to come back to the office.
It was an affordable housing conference. And my son, who is a bit of a character, said, I look around the room, I see a lot of real estate developers. If any deals happen during the luncheon, I want a 10% cut. Yeah. So
I think a lot of people don't understand how important relationships are, particularly in this community. And I think because real estate is, even if it's a private function, you're serving a public need.
For sure.
Which then it's like an artist who puts out their music or their film or whatever. They are subject to criticism. Why? Because you put this out to the public. Here, people are living here.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
You're subject to criticism and your reputation's on the line.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, New York real estate developers are not the most popular group of people in the last 10, 15 years. I don't know why.
It does.
I honestly don't know why. When I get attacked, at meetings and, you're a selfish developer, I always say I've spent my life building thousands of affordable housing units. I do this to make a living. I'm not, building $1 million condo, multi-million-dollar condos. So like I said, obviously I have to make a living. I have children, but I don't understand why real estate developers have become public enemy number one. And I think it comes down to the fact that I think there's a mistaken attachment to rents rising to blaming developers. And like I said, that's
market driven.
That's market driven.
Blame your local
That's
government
exactly
official.
And
right.
it's interesting to see because you don't see that in other areas, in other states. You see like developers come in here and they talk about possibly moving to Florida,
100%.
and the community in Florida is welcoming them with open arms, saying, "Please come build more housing for us."
For sure. I mean, look, why is I'm going to answer a question for all your listeners. Why are the rents so damn high in New York? And I will make it very clear to you in a second. A multifamily building in New York is taxed for their aggregate real estate bill at about 25 to 28% of the gross revenue. So if the building has, let's say, $1 million of gross revenue, it's a small building, you're talking about $270,000 of taxes. And so if you were renting an apartment for $4,000 a month, that would be $48,000 a year. That means 3 months of what the landlord collects at a gross level before you have to pay operating expenses goes to pay taxes. So, when people get frustrated with the development community about why are rents so high, I sort of say, look, why do people get to live in a co-op and pay less taxes than a condo? Why are single family homes taxed so much less aggressively than multifamily units? But it's easy to blame the boogeyman, and the real estate community has become the boogeyman in all this. But we are subject to the laws and economics of the city, and I think that if we were all to pick up and leave tomorrow, rents would go up even higher.
The Inwood one, that is a good example of temperatures running real high in terms of
Absolutely.
more people coming in. They're stretching. I mean, they have the same arguments over and over on both sides, actually. It's going to stretch everything too thin. There are not enough transportation or services for people. And what you want to do is you want to either upzone or rezone to allow for residential or more residential. And you're just getting a bunch of pushback from, for lack of better, because of NIMBYism.
Yeah. Look, I always tell people philosophically, I know we need to build more housing. Practically, if it was my neighborhood, I could understand the frustration, right? You have a lot of construction going on. It creates a lot of dirt. If your subway stop was already crowded, it's going to be more crowded. Change is not something that people deal with so well. So I do understand where NIMBYism comes from. And it's obviously something that I have to fight, but I am sensitive to it. And I do try lately, much to the detriment of my mental health and self-esteem, to meet with community stakeholders. And I actually debated on The Real Deal a Northern Manhattan is not for sale activist. And I explained to her that our site was basically zoned M1. And if the rezoning doesn't go through, I can build a warehouse and I'll lease it, to Amazon and it's going to create 8 jobs. And, that's one outcome. Or if the rezoning passes, I'm going to build 611 units of affordable housing, all of which is governed by a regulatory agreement. And most of which, half the units are going to be permanently affordable. So I said,
Right.
what I said, by you defeating me and you opposing my rezoning, I'm not sure that you're going to get the outcome that you think you're going to get. But look, I get it. Nobody likes change, and construction is not a pleasant thing to live through. That's the truth. So I get it. I represent change. I said it from the beginning, right? I told you about Oceana, where my good friends live. And, I said it went from a beach club to condo development, but it was more than that. It was about changing this neighborhood. And I'm sure there were people who didn't like that. And I get it. But, stagnation is a very bad thing for an urban area. It's not good to be stagnant in terms of population growth. It's not good to be stagnant in terms of housing creation. We live in what I think is the most dynamic city in the world. We have to make a decision if we want to keep it that way. Doing nothing is never yields much.
Yeah. Doing nothing is also making a decision as well. When you're going out scouting properties looking to develop, how does that process work, and how do you determine the development site, and then to proceed with the rezoning, it doesn't have the FAR that you need for that project?
So, city planning puts up on their websites the neighborhood studies that they're doing, and I try to stay on top of what areas they're studying to sort of get a sense of where the city is focused on in terms of expanding resources, expanding or changing zoning. So I try to, stay in the loop on that, both from public resources online, also from speaking with people. And I also remember that, New York has to spread the love around, right? So East New York went through a massive rezone, and there were a lot of projects that were built then. If someone were to show me a site in East New York right now, it wouldn't excite me that much, because I know the city feels like, yes, we had that rezoning, we accomplished a lot, we need to move our resources out. So I'm always trying to put myself in the mindset of government of what areas and what neighborhoods would be appealing to the city. I mean, a big part of affordable housing is great PR for, whoever is the administration at the time.
Yeah.
And so I try to put myself in the shoes that I was when I was in government, which is that you're working towards, making the city a better place. You're working towards making your boss, the mayor, look good. And I try to, use that mindset to think, well, if we build another 200 units of low-income housing in East New York, that's not going to move the needle very much. But building a all-affordable waterfront complex in Inwood that also has a waterfront park that's going to create a thoroughfare all along the waterfront, I think that was something that immediately struck me as something that would be successful. Did I anticipate the Ali Frazier fight we had over that rezoning? No.
I mean, that was unprecedented, right?
It was unprecedented. It was the first time that it happened. And to be very candid with you, it was an issue that I don't think people understood the importance of that decision at the state Supreme Court being overturned by the appellate division on the Court of Appeals, because I think it would have chilled rezonings indefinitely.
For those who don't understand the background, can you just go into what happened a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So a rezoning was passed, and in Inwood, it was sponsored by the city. It was not a private rezoning. I owned a site that was in it, and immediately after, a nonprofit or community group filed a lawsuit claiming that the city improperly did their studies, didn't take racial and certain other demographics into account. And the statutes that cover that just don't have those things in them to be part of the studies that they have to do. If you've ever seen an EIS, an environmental impact study, there are thousands of pages. The city spent.
I haven't read them because I thousands of
I get it. I assure you, the city does so much work in terms of making sure that schools, there'll be enough seats in schools, that there'll be enough transportation, shadow analysis, environmental impact, water, sewer. The amount of work that goes into complying with the regulations to get something rezoned through the ULERT process is immense and takes years. And the challenge was, well, they didn't take racial aspects and income aspects into account. That would it displace poor people or people of different races? Would that have an impact on it? Now, I don't think that that's the worst, point of view. I actually think, but it's just not in the statute.
Right.
So I thought the case would be dismissed as every other challenge to the lawsuits to rezonings were prior to that. East Harlem had a similar challenge, and the judge threw it out. And the judge,
It
And
just goes to show
We
you,
got
judges.
lucky.
Yeah, judges can do.
we
what,
got lucky, but I
they
will
need
tell
to.
you that it was in the middle of COVID. I was on my roof on a laptop listening to the appellate court arguments. And I remember leaving and calling my partner, George Madruga. I was like, I think we just lost the case. And then it came back 5-0 in favor of us. And then they went up to the next court. But when it's a unanimous decision at the first appellate, the higher court usually doesn't even listen to the case.
They decided not to take, the Court of Appeals
Right.
didn't take the case.
The Court of Appeals didn't take
But
the
the
case.
appellate division, I clerked for a judge, so I've seen oral arguments. I've also done oral arguments, and you cannot tell by the judge's questions or how hard a judge is on you whether or not you're winning or losing.
Look
at the clerks. That's what you have to look at.
I left that Zoom. It was on a Zoom. I left that Zoom and I called George and I was like, okay, we lost and we won unanimously. And look, like I said, I don't think that their argument was so off.
It just wasn't pursuant to law.
It's just not pursuant to law. And
It's a
I
big
always
thing, right?
I always tell people, we have voting for a reason. We can change laws.
Change law.
If they want to change the law for, I think it would be SECRA, they can. And I don't think that's the worst analysis to be included. Just was not pursuant to law.
I mean, I think that you must have been just shaking, just thinking about, because all this planning, all of this work that you've done.
I
and
slept
now
like a
it's-
baby.
No, I mean, afterwards, right?
No, I woke up every 30 minutes and cried.
I mean, that goes to show you it's difficult, and things can happen. It's such an unprecedented. The reason why I wanted to mention is because it's really an unprecedented thing. It's not something that many people have gone through.
I wish I listened to my dad. He told me to become an orthodontist. I said, you never have any emergencies. Like, you have a very relaxed life. I was like, no, I'm going to become an affordable housing developer. I went in the complete opposite direction.
It's hard, and like you said, you have to pivot constantly. It's just constant pivoting and changing direction and figuring things out. But it sounds like you've done it. You've survived, and you are optimistic.
I am. You have to be, right? You have to be.
We are too. We think we're fully. We feel that the 421A will come back in some shape or form, if not this year, then next year.
We have to be optimistic about it.
I
And,
think
Never
near,
an
guys.
option.
I think next year.
2025.
I think next year.
And so the way that we got you on the show is because you knew Alvin, and Alvin actually
Yeah.
knew you almost when you were like a kid, like a 20-year-old kid.
At
And
HTC.
he'll really appreciate listening to you. Could you do you remember at all? If you don't remember,
Of course. I remember deals where Sign and Shine and Alvin represented the borrower. He represented the ARCers a lot.
Yep.
And the old 421A certificate deals. So I was the project manager and Alvin was the attorney, and I spoke to him all the time. And
you are just a phenomenal guest. I could probably talk to you for another 3 hours. I won't, because Brenda and Camilla will be so upset, and so will you, I think.
We all have work to do, David.
yeah, that is true. We all have work to do, and we have to remember production,
Yeah.
right? So if we keep just, talking about me,
Yeah.
we won't be doing production.
Well, the cool thing is that
While I'm not overly optimistic about it coming back soon, I think that housing start number is going to be a very powerful message to the powers that be that this is not going well.
Something
It
you think is-
seems as if it's just a stalemate between 421A and good cause eviction,
which have nothing to do with each
but
other.
have nothing to do with each other. But, I think that good cause eviction was so completely unacceptable to the real estate community that they didn't even fight the 421A. But I think there has to be a compromise. There's always got to be a compromise, right? That's life.
No, I couldn't. If it's a lawyer, I definitely know. there's
Except for my 15-year-old daughter.
Well,
Right.
that's a different story. I don't know.
As a former 15-year-old daughter, I agree.
Is there anything else that you want to say that we didn't ask you, or promote, or information you want to give out to our audience if they want to contact you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Eli Weiss. I'm usually pretty responsive. I love meeting new people and interesting people, especially people who are, in my industry, all types of real estate folks. And I'll be candid with you. I think that I wanted to thank you guys for having me here, and also for the part and the role that you guys play in production of housing. The lawyers don't get enough appreciation. What's the job? I'm a lawyer, but given the complexities of building affordable housing, if we didn't have great lawyers like yourselves, it wouldn't get done. So Sign and Shine plays a big role, and has historically. You guys have been a real mainstay in the affordable housing world for.
Well, we hope that to continue that legacy into the future.
Amen.
And we really appreciate you coming down here and sharing all
Yeah,
your thoughts.
thank you so
Oh,
much.
please.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All
Thanks.
good.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and Beaslakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.